Episode 40, we're on.
Oh, are we? Sure.
Yep.
Oh.
On your toes, everyone, especially you.
I got to do airplane mode. Hold on.
Oh, really? You do that? That's
Yeah.
smart.
You don't?
No.
Oh. What happens if someone texts you? You just read it? You just look at it?
No, I don't look at it. But if it's insistent enough, I'll look.
Oh, okay.
But
you can hear me fine?
I hear you
Okay,
great.
great.
Every episode starts with us wondering about the sound. But that's because we don't...
We don't pre-check. we don't do levels.
No, we do. We have some preparation, but I was going to tell the frustrating experience I had this morning, but I'm not going to. Let's talk about...
Well, we left with a cliffhanger, right? Last episode, it was a thought experiment about like if all of humanity died, how would you leave instructions on how to build a human?
Yeah.
I guess many would claim that that's impossible, and it's a really fascinating new thing that people are trying to wrap their heads around in terms of how we think about the way that information is passed down, like through generations and from an individual to an individual, like from mother to child, or from the hermaphroditic fusion to child. Just like that, the instructions are not enough. Like the IKEA instructions are not enough. The genome is not enough. The blueprint is not enough. The egg and sperm is not enough. You actually need not only the A womb, maybe, it's arguably like we just haven't done the work on this to know like the exact kind of details and boundaries of what you actually need to grow a creature. But the thing that the guy Michael Levin found that's so fascinating and blew everyone's mind is that like electrical activity during the early stages can shape what happens, can shape the species that you end up with. And that's just so wildly, it's not necessarily like contrary to dogma, but it's just so like out of left field. It's beautiful. It's this kind of like third input into the creation of life.
But this is reminding me a bit of like, Stephen Wolfram's like, what do they call the little mini formulas, not automatons or something. He figured out that you can have small, very simple instructions and that there are like little kind of formulas. And then you let the instruction kind of iterate over and over again. And the simplest instructions can breed incredible complexity. And so you just have an instruction that's iterated over and over again. Yeah. And suddenly you get complexity to a level that you can't find those patterns that are after 1,000 iterations, except by going through the 1,000 iterations. It is contained in the formula in the sense that only the formula exists, but it's not, you can't find it without going through the entire process. So this seems like a real world application of that idea, that infinite complexity can come from simple instructions, and you can't find the results in the instructions without going through all of the steps of those instructions. Yeah,
one of my favorite examples of this is the gradient descent thing, which has found like a new home in AI research. But as far as I understand it, like something like a fly, for example, how, I don't know, we've seen the Breaking Bad episode about the fly. Yeah, remember that?
I love Breaking Bad, but I'm not remembering.
You don't remember that? There's an entire episode dedicated to like a fly gets into the meth making facility.
That's right. Yeah,
and it's just about like finding and killing this one obvious symbolism for obsession. And but like there is something so aggravating about these tiny little robot creatures that you like shoo them away and they just fly right back to you. They just find their way immediately back, right? They kind of like they seem to understand, and they seem to understand your hate, and they seem to take joy in just like bothering you and bugging you, and they just always find you. And the way that they do that, it's kind of well known. They just use a thing called gradient descent, which is just kind of like if an olfactory cue is slightly denser to the left versus the right, go left. And if you just iterate on that, if you just follow it, you get the behavior that looks like the fly is kind of trying to get you. We imbue it with all these kind of like human characteristics of like intention or it feels almost like it's obsessed with you, but it's just following this very simple algorithm. And there's all kinds of examples of these like really simple algorithms that end up creating what appears to be really complex behavior in life.
But you were going even farther, saying that you can't, if we left the genomic instructions for an alien race, because all the humans were going to be, they couldn't run that program and get the womb to make
And
the
get
baby.
a human. Right. Old. A couple years ago. This film Lucy, Scarlett Johansson.
I didn't see it.
No. So basically, like the pitch would be, this is how I imagine like a Hollywood executive or the writer walking into the room was just like, all right, we have Scarlett Johansson. She starts as kind of a street walker and ends up as God in the course of the hour and a half of the film. Terrible film. So many interesting ideas in it. One of them, though, is that they essentially were able to synthesize, reduce, distill, and synthesize the molecule that induces consciousness in fetal development in the womb, and it just becomes a drug in the future. And Scarlett Johansson ends up not by her own will, kind of like a drug mule with the stuff in her stomach, and she gets injured, and the thing breaks open, and she becomes God. And because she's just like filled with whatever the consciousness molecule is. And of course we don't know, and nobody really believes that is a thing, but it's not impossible. It's not out of scientific plausibility to imagine that there is actually something that induces maybe like a kind of network connectivity at some point in fetal development that will ultimately resemble consciousness, that will ultimately resemble like thinking. And I just kind of like loved in this terrible science fiction film these like really interesting, neat ideas, because we just simply don't know where the unbroken lineage of just like life is contained. And it seems to be, and this is what's so profoundly destabilizing about the Michael Levin's research, is that there's a layer of just electrical activity that seems to be involved in shaping the kind of creature that you end up being, or that a fetus or an egg or whatever it is ends up being, a worm, whatever it may be. And it's just totally wild because it means it's programmable. It means that if you understood the code by which that electricity is shaping things, you might be able to have almost like biological like Play-Doh kits. Like it's literal ancient Greek like putty in the hands of the gods that you can form into a creature of your making and desire. It's pretty wild.
So bringing together our conversation last time about free will versus determinism and everything you've said just now, given the choice, would you like to procreate? And insofar as the answer is yes or no, how much of that is instinct driven and how much of that is, do you think, a higher level kind of decision making?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I want 6 kids. I want 0 or 6.
How old are you?
37.
You better start soon.
I don't need to start soon. Whoever
That's
is
true.
that future womb needs to probably graduate from high school. So yeah, so my thinking is, I mean, it's a bit silly. I want 6 only because I think that would be the best recipe to create a novelist out of
Why?
one of them. I don't know. I have a theory based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever that like the 5th out of 6 will be the best storyteller. And not just storyteller, but
So the other 4
the best writer.
are just cogs in that machine
Oh
to
yeah,
create
absolutely.
that 5th one.
Absolutely. And I will of course pretend and give them my all as if like essential to this strategy is that nobody knows what's up. So we'll have to delete
They
this.
have to delete the episode.
Delete this episode. Just put this episode under like a pseudonym. It's not me saying it. I just have I don't know why, but so I try to write, and I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to write fiction. That's the only thing I think of is worthwhile and valuable. Ultimately, like when I'm 80, I want to be sitting around a dinner table, a long dinner table, and have the 6 kids and ignore, the non-writer, and just have, for me personally, 1 novel out and published. I will die happy if that happens. But I know that what's going to happen is I'm going to be like the Venus and Serena Williams' dad, or Steph Curry's dad, or Tiger Woods' dad, where they were all into the sport that their kid ended up excelling at, right? Kid or kids ended up excelling at. Steph Curry's dad played basketball. He was great. He was pretty good. He was a professional player. He wasn't great. Venus and Serena Williams' dad played tennis. Tiger Woods' dad played golf, but they just weren't great at it. They were like amateurs at it. But when you do this, Archie Manning, good. Peyton and his sons, stellar. And so what you end up doing is like, I find it interesting. This isn't, we're talking about this kind of like transgenerational passage of knowledge. There's something so much more going on there that's probably mostly like a weird mix of like social opportunity and genetics and maybe some training data, like really, really young. Like Steph Curry was throwing layups in an actual NBA basketball court. There's a picture of it or video of him as like a toddler doing this, right? So he's just been on an NBA court since he was a toddler. And that kind of training data gets you good at something. We're just sponges for skills.
It's so interesting. Like Paco de Lucia, who's the culmination and the peak of flamenco guitar that ever existed before and after. His father decided early on that one of his sons is going to be the greatest guitar player to ever have walked the earth, and he forced his two sons to play 12 hours a day of guitar. And it's one brother, Paco, it worked. He became the greatest. And his brother, Ramon, none of the magic. It's so interesting. They had the same education. He's skillfully great, obviously. I mean, when you play that young and that often, you're steeped in the culture, you're going to be good at it. But he was lacking that one, that extra something that creates genius, right? And I've always wondered about the ethics of that decision that the father made, who was probably a frustrated guitarist himself. And to be honest, I've thought it too. Like I've started playing piano late in life, and wish I'd started earlier. And when I do fantasize about having kids, I do dream of introducing them to music early. But then you hear all these stories of people being forced to play the piano when they're young, and then they end up hating it. And yet I wish that I had been forced, and I wish I'd had that discipline early on and had those tools given to me, because otherwise you just never will reach that level. But I think having kids to live out your dreams is the worst possible idea you could possibly have.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm being facetious, but also I know myself. And it's the thing where okay, so my name is not actually Patrick. My name is Ken. My first name is Ken. Patrick is my middle name. My father, his name is Marvin Kendall House. And at some point in his maturation, he decided, he was Marvin Kendall House III. And he decided that he disliked the kind of patrimonial lineage and the name Marvin. And so he went by his middle name. At some point, I think I was in kindergarten, in my coming of age story, decided also that I hated my first name. And so I'm going to go by of all the infinite things that I could possibly choose in my rebellion and creativity, I chose my middle name. And
not knowing this about your father.
Not knowing this about my father. Right. So clearly it's genetic, and clearly I am going to name my kid, one of them, I don't know, maybe the fifth, the one I care about, with the name that I want to give them as the middle name. So at some point they will rebel and choose the middle name, at which point I will then be like, oh no, why would you do that? I thought you were named after me. That's so insulting. And in the back of my mind, I will know that I have caused this. And so, but the key to this is no one can know. The key to this is that the strategy must be held tightly in my mind alone.
He announces to the world.
Well, but here's the thing that I actually find, okay, we can make this more actually interesting, an actual philosophical question. How would you, we're talking about skill-based piano, tennis, football, these kinds of things. First of all, it's no coincidence that Venus and Serena are sisters, that Steph Curry's brother, Seth, also plays in the NBA, right? There's people that are good. They often have brothers. Eli Manning has Peyton Manning, right? They have a brother that also did the thing, or brother or sister that also did the thing, a sibling that's there. And that's why I think it's really important that they're the fifth of six, that they have a bunch of siblings to run stories off of, and that they are mostly dominated so they don't end up the four older kids will be able to provide, this is my theory, The four older kids will be able to provide a social knowledge and social learning about primate hierarchy to the degree that most people don't get exposed to, right? So they'll have four gradations of primate hierarchies of ages. Let's imagine that each one is 1 year apart and they're just, second through sixth grade or whatever. Each of those kids will implicitly or explicitly be teaching what it's like to be a third grader, what it's like to be a fourth grader, fifth grader, and at that age and maturity level. And so all of that information will be passively observed by the fifth of the sixth, right? So they'll have four, not only the adults will try to teach what the adult world is like, but they'll mostly fail. That's me. And then, but the four siblings will do a lot of the teaching. And yeah, it won't be efficient. And yeah, it might be like wrong or bullying or, just, it might be bad. But at the very least, it'll be knowledge about how the world works at a gradation and resolution that is not available to an only child.
I saw many years ago a documentary on, these people like Aubrey de Grey who think that we're going to live 1,000 years or longer. And it profiled like 7 different people who are obsessed with living forever. And there was like this couple that was super creepy because they just like were, calorie restriction is the one proven way so far of like stopping the aging process. So like this couple like ate like 7 almonds a day and like 3 leaves of spinach. They had figured out the bare minimum for survival. Right. And were planning on living forever. And of course, and there was something sad about it because it looked like they were just like trying to extend a miserable life without the simple pleasures of eating. And then this aspect of their personality seemed to spill into other pleasures. And you couldn't help wonder, like, why do they want to live so long? They don't look even happy with the life, the potentially short life. And then at the end of the documentary, the narrator kind of casually observed that none of the subjects of the documentary had children, and that in a way, and I remember, my father hinting at this often, having children is a form of living longer. You feel yourself, being passed on. He used to call us his reincarnation or his afterlife. And as I see more and more of my friends not wanting to have children and not having this impetus, the optimist in me thinks maybe that's a sign that we are going to live a really long time, by the kind of corollary of this idea that if you want to live forever, it's because you don't have children. Maybe if you don't want children, it's because you're going to live forever. And the human race is not not forever, but long enough, because we don't feel this need. And I have more and more friends who are just not interested. Yeah. Like, men who have had vasectomies and just say, no way. Why would I want to? There's a million reasons we can discuss for not having children. There's certainly very easy to make the argument, whether it's for the good of the world, the greatest thing you can do more than recycling or buying a Prius is not having children, if you care about the environment.
Well, not having a white Western child.
Right.
They are drains, but there are many children born into many circumstances that are net positive
for the world.
For the world.
But if we just stop, obviously we don't want to stop reproducing completely. And there is a problem in places like Italy and Japan where we have negative population growth, and that causes an aging population that becomes a real drain on resources in its own way. But I don't know, part of me wonders if the decline in the actual instinct and need to have children is a sign that we will live a lot longer. I don't know, maybe that's just absurdly rose-colored glasses of me, but well, yeah, I used to have the instinct more, and now I'm 45. It hasn't happened. Maybe if the opportunity presents itself and a change in my life happens, that it becomes this compelling, need and desire, but I don't feel like it's requisite for having a meaningful existence. Although then when I see older people who have had no children, I do think they're probably missing something. I'm on the fence about it.
So my deepest joy in life comes from the ability to kind of let's see, experience and perceive things that happen with a slightly new, nuanced, more expert frame. So for example, like I don't necessarily want to like make a movie at some point in my life, but I would do it once for the process of then having movie watching be a richer experience for me for the rest of my life, because I understand a little bit about what it took to make it. I don't, I'm not going to make bread from scratch ever again, but I used to, and now I know and can appreciate little bits and pieces about what goes into that. And I wish deeply that I had more knowledge so as to enhance the richness of just like everyday things that I experience. I have a friend whose father is a Japanese carpenter. I mentioned him in the father's talk a little bit ago, and he walks into a sushi restaurant and he looks up. He looks up at the ceiling because he knows that there's going to be good Japanese craft in woodworking. And I look up and I literally see nothing. Like I don't see what he sees. And I think that one of the more selfish but beautiful reasons to have a child, if nothing else, I imagine this is the kind of like depressive salve that children provide, which is you suddenly start seeing the world through their and therefore new eyes. I remember being at this kind of like the northwestern tip of Seattle, some Easter, and I was just kind of like on some beach thing, and I didn't even realize it was Easter. And we were staying in a hotel, my girlfriend and I at the time. And I wake up and I go and take my coffee and I go down to the beach, and just a large man in an Easter bunny suit is just kind of forlornly walking, like kind of like kicking stones as if he was just broken up with, like along the ocean, right? About like maybe like 8 a.m. And I derived nothing from this. I personally, Patrick, I was maybe 32 at the time, derived no pleasure from this. But I had this very strange moment of realizing that if I had a kid, or maybe even a dog would function similarly, they would enjoy the large human-sized Easter bunny, and therefore I would. Like,
right.
By virtue of their enjoyment, I would then have a new appreciation. And the thing that seems cool about this is that it feels like that increased appreciation comes for free. There's no cost to it.
I think if you talk to parents, the cost is enormous. Like basically sacrificing your entire life.
No, I don't mean the cost of raising a child. I mean,
no, I'm not talking about cost. I'm talking about just like
the mental and emotional toll and the time and et cetera. Yeah. So I guess I don't mean
them.
What I don't mean. Yes. And there's a cost to training in Japanese carpentry, and there's a cost to learning how to make bread and therefore appreciating it. There's a time sink if I were to make a movie so as to understand and appreciate movies more. But what I mean is just thinking and focusing and like honing in on that appreciation aspect, it seems like we have the capacity to appreciate infinitely. Like if we could spend 1,000 years in an Aubrey de Grey future world training all these different things, if I had 1,000 years to learn every language and learn how to play music and write a novel and make a movie and do Japanese carpentry for 100 years, at the end of that 1,000 years, it feels like there's an infinite capacity within us to appreciate more about what we see. And that I think is like I think that's kind of the only thing to do with life, is just to continually do things so that you can appreciate what you experience more. And maybe having a kid gets you that. And that seems and in a way that nothing else could or would. And that seems really beautiful.
Yeah, because all of these are creative utterances you're talking about, whether it's the carpentry, the sushi, the bread, all of that. And then it's in a way the ultimate, most fundamental creative act is to create a human.
Absolutely.
And it's the most miraculous and amazing. And the idea that a skill opens up a world of meaningful differences. We've talked about this from different angles many times, and it's what the film Being in the World is about. I have noticed that unfortunately the world is going towards a place where we have fewer and fewer of those opportunities to understand how something is made. Like there's no way you're going to understand how the iPhone works, how it was made, how, and it does all these things. And yet when interviewed Manuel Molina, who's this master flamenco guitarist and poet, he had such an appreciation for all of the things like you're talking about. Like all his clothes were hand tailored. He couldn't stand the idea of wearing clothes that didn't have the right, went to a specialist just for the stitching, and another person like did the buttons. And he said in the film, he says, everybody knows that there's a huge difference in the way food tastes if you eat it off of a plate that was made by hand, right? Because exactly what you're talking about, right? Like when there's like the Japanese restaurant, the food tastes better because the sealing is well crafted, right?
Right.
And so unfortunately, we're going towards a world where there's fewer and fewer opportunities for that experience. We went with Manuel to the guitar builders atelier in Seville. And this was wonderful because he went in there and looked at the raw wood. And he was so in tune with this very Heideggerian idea of like skillfulness kind of becoming a focal point for significance, right? Because he said the guitar builder always wants to say, I'm going to build the best guitar, but he doesn't know if he's going to build the best guitar because he has to be responding to that unique piece of wood, and he has to be, and the humidity in the room, and so many factors that he doesn't have control over. And what emerges then is something that becomes something that one can dialogue with, right? Which is also different from the iPhone, which are all exactly the same, right? So each guitar, he says, you learn to love her, right? And you have this incredible relationship. And so as we, he held the wood, he looked with great joy and awe and admiration. And then as we were like walking down this dark staircase, we were leaving, and he whispers to me, Tao, I've only had 2 regrets in my entire life. And one is not to have made a guitar. And I was like, and the other? He says, never to have fucked Claudia Cardinale, who was the great Italian actress from 8.5, great, beauty. I didn't put that in the movie, but it's good for the podcast.
And I hate this sentence as my brain came up with it, but we're in a deterministic world, so it's not my fault. But we also don't know the provenance or how to make the ultimate iPhone, the human brain. Right? Like that's the whole point to bring it back around to the Michael Levin stuff. Like we have no idea how these things are formed. We have no idea. Like, and it's, to me, that's perhaps, I would probably get interested in a kid if I kind of intentionally or accidentally had one. Like I would probably be like, all right, fine. I'll read some developmental neuroscience papers. This is kind of interesting now. But like the idea that if I were designing this from scratch, I would obviously like take a pre-existing human brain. If someone tasked me with designing fertility and reproduction in the act from scratch, I'd be like, well, okay, you take an adult human brain. I guess it's from the woman. I don't know. There's matrilineal. And you take a piece of the brain out. You like literally, carve some out, scoop it out, and you, like a bud. That's how you graft like some kinds of plants. You have to like take a clipping and then grow it again. I would think, obviously, how the hell could you get consciousness from scratch again? How do we keep making consciousness from scratch? Like, how come it's not some feature of the thing that exists, and you have to carve out like an ice cream scoop of it and then put it in a pot and then grow? It's ridiculous. You take all of consciousness and you filter it back down to a single cell, and then it regrows again, and then you filter it back down to a single cell, and it regrows again every generation. They're like, if you stop to think about it, it's completely insane. And it's back to that immortality story you said. There are actually some biological creatures that do this as adults, that will grow and then revert back to a single cell, and then grow into adulthood and then revert back to a single cell. There's something called Turptosis nutricula, the little immortal jellyfish. I've talked about it before, but it's got this life cycle where its cells kind of continually propagate themselves, and they do the reversion back to a single cell on their own. And instead, we mammals and most life, for whatever reason, I don't think anyone really knows why or what the advantage is. Maybe it's to avoid cancer, or, like there must be some cost to perpetuating a single clump of cells forever. Otherwise, we would do that. There must be some cost. Maybe it's accumulation of mutations. Maybe it's hard to have memory. I think that's the most likely theory, that you can't have memory. The formation of memories is actually destructive. The formation of memories is not springing something new, like a new leaf flowering. That's not a new memory. A memory, when it forms in your synapse, destroys all the things that are not that memory. It's not an act of creation, it's an act of destruction.
Interesting.
And so maybe that's there's just a fundamental biochemical reason why you can't have the same cells live forever. But it's just so fascinating to me that, consciousness for how obviously miraculous it is, we just keep making it. Anything can make it. Just stupid little bird outside.
I'm curious.
Not the chicken. There's a dumber bird.
I'm very curious though about the level of understanding that's necessary in order to have the meaning that we're discussing. So you said we don't understand the brain and how the consciousness works, and obviously you're digging into that level of explanation on the the neuronal level. And then a psychologist might, be more interested in the level of actual, the way thoughts manifest in behavior, right? And Manuel, was interested in how the wood turns into a guitar, and that process of carving and selecting the wood and having that relationship with the builder. But he doesn't need a degree in molecular biology to have the significance that comes from those relationships. He doesn't have to understand how the tree grows, right? So the other great thing that I think Michael Evans said in that podcast is that we think we want the most fundamental explanation always, but actually what we want is the level of explanation at which we are trying to intervene with the world, right? So if I want to convince you to, take a walk with me afterwards, I'm going to use language understanding, I'm not going to try and enter your brain and find those synapses that's going to be the impetus for going on a walk synapses. That would just be absurd. And even if we did have that, we probably will never have that level of understanding, right? The idea is that the it's not necessarily built in to the initial equation. The physics equations don't have the answer to whether you want to have children. That's going to be based on a cultural explanation, a psychological explanation, maybe one day a neurological explanation. But it seems like what I took away from that podcast more than anything is that we always discuss this in different ways, is how important is it to reduce an explanation, and when is that appropriate, and when is it ignoring larger realities that actually count just as much as meaningful explanations.
My publisher's going to yell at me for spoiling all my best elegance anecdotes. But there's a guy, Edward Tufte, this kind of design guru, published a bunch of books, and I was interviewing him about what his concept of elegance is. And in the room to do this interview was this guy, Jonathan Coram, who's I think head designer or a design lead, or maybe just designer for the New York Times for all their infographics. And I ended up also talking with him about elegance. And he gave, I think, one of the most beautiful and correct answers, or kind of conceptual wanderings rather than answers. That's what I try to get out of people, not answers directly, but just conceptual wanderings. And he said, scale matters. It was to this exact point where you have to choose a scale. And he said, let's take the most canonical example of elegance in motion, a ballerina. A ballerina, his words were so perfectly strung together, but effectively he said, a ballerina is only elegant at the distance they're meant to be seen from the audience, from X amount of feet away by the human apparatus of perception. He said, if you zoomed in on the sweat glands of a ballerina as she's on point, that's not elegant. If you looked at the destruction of the pain in her bones and you took an X-ray and you saw the more morbid background that was required to get good at this, to get this good at it. Or if you zoomed out and looked at it from hundreds of thousands of light years away, it's nothing, Yeah. And so he's like, what is elegance? You cannot conceive of, you cannot ask this question without first asking, at what scale are you perceiving the thing you're talking about? And I think that's to that, you can imagine, instead of a spatial distance from a ballerina, you can imagine that same kind of scale in terms of explanations for things. Do you want the atomic explanation, the quantum explanation, the explanation at the level of the sweat droplet pouring out of her skin? Do you want it at the universal? And so I think that's a really difficult to know thing, what the right scale is to approach a problem. And I think most expertise could probably be boiled down or explained as the ability to know at what scale to tackle a problem.
And it's also just a choice. Like, I remember being more interested in philosophy because of the scale of the issues that it tackled, versus classmates that were more interested in psychology, which in a way it's also just trying to understand what's going on. Right. But you have the neuroscientist, the psychologist, and the philosopher are just basically tackling different scales, right? I mean, someone was arguing on Twitter yesterday whether Foucault should be seen as a philosopher or historian. And again, I think this idea that it's the level is where you are actually wanting to make a difference.
Right.
And that's the world that we choose, or it chooses us. But I think we have to just accept that they're just separate domains, and that's okay,
Right.
and they can coexist. I mean, the atomic explanation and is there, and it's true, but that doesn't. It's not the emotional or psychological or philosophical explanation isn't any less true because it's on a larger scale, and nor is it contained in the formulas. And I think that the scientist has to accept that.
And I actually know that the scale at which I want to impact the world, and it is through literature.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And I, play out the scenario in my head, and maybe I'll have a book or two by the time I'm 80, but I'm not prolific enough. I don't sit down and type long enough to do anything real. But
he's being modest. He's always working.
No, but it's not. It's like I can tell that the impact I want to have, though, might actually be achieved. And I know this is completely nefarious, and no one listening would ever want to have a child with someone who, first of all, you haven't even met them yet, but and is very explicit about the fact that they want their kid to be a novelist, and that so as to be better than them, so as to achieve the scale at which they want to impact the world vicariously, but maybe immortally, right? Or maybe in that way that's okay. Maybe it's okay for future generations to achieve the thing that you didn't. And I honestly, one of the biggest reasons, one of the biggest kind of thought experiments I go through that ultimately ends up convincing me that I do want to have kids is I think to myself, in ancient Rome or ancient Greece, if I were to have this debate, I would also think that civilization was kind of at its near end, or peak or apex, or something. And it'd be well, maybe not. Maybe I won't have a kid. But then think about if my ancestor didn't do that. You're obliterating hundreds of thousands of future people by this choice, potentially. Not everyone's like Genghis Khan, but I think humanity isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon, and there is a very real chance that we are going to live 1 million years.
I hope so.
Right? So that means that we are in basically if you look at the timeline of like single cell to adult human and map it onto maybe like humanity is just like a single life, we are like an egg that just reproduced. Like, you know, we're at 2 cells. We just divided for the first time ever. We are in the very beginning, the pre-infancy of the human species, of the human experience, the human everything. And so to decide now in 2020 AD, after a couple thousand years of civilization, like, oh, no, this is it. I'm going to, even though
be a dead end.
Yeah, I'm going to be a dead end for 2 kind of lineages. Like, nah, no more. Like, what if we live to be 1 million years? You know, we have 1 million years left of humanity. That kind of, who am I to, I guess, deny whatever 1 million minus 2020 years of my I guess the part that does actually create inner conflict to me is like, why does it have to be my
Right,
genes?
exactly.
Like, what is that about?
It's
That part
still,
makes no sense. And I'm sure even by like 2050, we'll just be tinkering and you can make any genetic line that you want. And probably by like 2300, we'll all just be, kids will just be grown in bags of, and they'll just be like an amalgamation of every human genome all combined into one, like little bits and pieces of everything. And there'll be no such thing as lineage anymore.
I know.
Lineage might easily die out. There's no reason to keep it.
Yeah, and also like the big question of like where are all the aliens? It's very possible in the direction that we're going that eventually we're gonna just become information in a little box that then creates multiple experiences for itself and doesn't need to manifest in this three-dimensional space-time that we know right now, which just seems kind of limited and clunky. And so, the idea of creating these biological creatures over and over again might just have a natural end into creating a much more ephemeral manifestation that exists in a way that we, primates are incapable of understanding right now.
Yeah, and I don't know why it has to be my kids, but I want them to see that. And I think it's fine if I think if of the 6, like 3 can be adopted, maybe, or 4 or 5. Maybe all 6. I'm not sure. I don't know where that happens. I don't know. I haven't yet assessed because I have no data on how I actually emotionally respond to this kids that are mine that I'm raising versus kids that are biologically mine, or whether or not that matters at all. I don't. It kind of sucks because at 37, I should have an opinion on this, or at least I should have some experience on this, and
Well, all of
I
my
just
friends,
don't.
I have this weird thing where I'm still good friends with a lot of people I knew in high school. I have no friends from college, but I still know like 15 or 20 of the kids I went to high school with. And a surprising majority of them don't have children. And the ones that do seem so grown up. And those of us who don't just seem to have this, like, for better or worse, this kind of, youthfulness, or childishness, depending how you want to interpret it. I think it's both. But again, my hope is that it's because we've got a little longer than I hopefully in 10, 20 years, there's going to be breakthroughs that let us live a few hundred years. And maybe Patrick, you and I can start when we're 80. My father started, still was having children in his 70s, and they're wonderful. So, women are able to have children later and later. But I think one thing I wanted to bring up before we stop is like
Before the dinosaur stops crowing.
the reductionist view is dangerous politically too. I think when it comes to like issues of sex and procreation. I mean, the conservative view that like, I remember when gay marriage was being debated hotly. Fortunately, the conservatives lost this debate. It was often like, oh, well, if it's not for procreation, then why should people partner up and why should people have sex? And, my dear friend Chris Ryan, who wrote Sex at Dawn, brings up in the book, well, if that were the case, that sex was primarily for procreation and, that kind of functionalist, reductionist view of sexuality, then why would people women after menopause still want to have sex? Why do it's not just gay sex? There's a lot of sex that's even if you look at the menstrual cycle, women are only ovulating a few days a month, and the rest of the time they can't get pregnant, and yet they're still desirous of sex. Thank God. And the idea is that sex has a more upper level explanation, which is on the level of like we use it to create bonds with people, to have like meaningful and memorable experiences with somebody, to like show ourselves as we actually are without the clothes that are both, not just to keep us warm, but also to like create a certain image of ourselves. So you're saying like kind of symbolically and actually look at me naked, look at who I am without what I show to the rest of the world. So you're creating this meaningful, deep experience. And I think that the risk of the reductionist impulse is to think that you've contained, and we're going to keep coming back to, I like that we keep coming back to this idea, is whether the whole is contained in the germinating seed, right? And so if the impetus for eating is for your nutrition and the impetus for sex is to procreate, does that mean that all the beautiful, meaningful meals that you've had and the culture that you've experienced when you've gone to the Japanese restaurant and had that sushi that was just to like give you calories? No. So these are all examples at which like the multiple levels of explanation also provide for a richer acceptance and understanding of why we do things.
And it is, I believe, still a quirk. I feel like we act quite irrationally when it comes to sex and reproduction. So I think it's true that the human female is the only kind of, I think, only primate and maybe only mammal that has this kind of non-seasonal estrus and non-seasonal reproduction, right? Even though it's only a few, like a small window per month, the fact that it's all year is completely anomalous in the mammalian reproductive world. And the fact that there's not apparent visual, there might be some olfactory cues or something, but not apparent visual signaling of estrus and reproductive ability is also very strange. Like you'd think there's a reason that when the window appears, there's some signal or cue, right? Usually it's seasonal, so it's very obvious in other primates and other kinds of mammals. And so there is something odd about, maybe not odd about non-reproductive sex. I mean, I think I only have sex because when I like run out of ways to make myself anxious alone, I might as well like bring someone into the fold. It kind of like multiplies in a way that we can be more anxious together than the sum of our parts. But it's also irrational. So I taught at Stanford, I TA'd, or like I helped teach Sapolsky's human behavior biology, and there's the whole kind of like sexual behavior aspect of it. And what I think is so funny is that if we were driven by evolutionary fitness alone, like fecundity, we would be going to sperm banks every week, right? Like
Right.
we, like as men, we should donate sperm. If you're trying to maximize your reproductive fitness, there is a system in place where for free, not just free, you get paid. You get given resources to help reproduce, and you don't even have to be there for the rearing of the kid. You could have tens of thousands of kids this way. Even just having a few, even a dozen, you win, according to every kind of motivational aspect of evolutionary biology. Like, why is it the case that there are not lines around the block at fertility centers and at sperm donor centers? It's completely anomalous, and I've never heard a good explanation for it. Like, I do think at some point, and I wonder, like,
The explanation is that the reductionist view is incomplete. But now it's
Right,
worse than incomplete. You're saying it's actually contrary.
yeah, I think it's irrational.
If the rational thing is
Yeah, like even if even if there was a small grain of truth to the idea that we are motivated because we want to pass on our line, you would still get some tiny percentage of people that are just regularly going to sperm banks and donating their sperm. And so I do actually wonder, like, I don't know when they cut off that age limit or whatever, but like maybe if I don't decide to have kids, I do actually kind of like the idea, and it's a bit, I'd have to come to terms with it, but of donating sperm and just like allowing kids to be out there.
that's somewhere in the back of your mind, or not even in
Yeah,
the back, in the front of your mind, they're yours.
Just because maybe I'll see the Easter Bunny and be like, okay, someone out there is enjoying that. Like maybe that'll help me, and then I'll find them when they're 22 and they've switched to their middle name, and I'll ask them how their writing is going. How do you make a novelist? How do you make a good novelist? Do you know the answer?
I don't.
Like we can make a good tennis player. You put a racket in their hand when they're 3, but how do you make a good novelist?
Lots of inflict a lot of psychological suffering, probably.
Yeah, it is that, isn't it? Well,
Okay, on that note,
if
call it a day.
If anyone knows how to make a novelist, wants to make a novelist with me, just
write him an email.
Yeah, anyone want to co-write a child? I love emails.
What's your email address?
This is gonna get weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
House.k